Hello and welcome to the studio here at African Utility Week. We're joined now by Glenn Hodes, who is from UNEP Centre. And Glenn, firstly, welcome and
Thank
thanks for
you.
taking the time to be here in the studio. And you gave a presentation earlier on about what the initiative is all about, but we were talking a little bit off air about actually maybe a more fundamental issue about how I suppose globally, so it's a big deal, balancing the whole climate change issue with sustainable energy, with the fact that at some point we will run out of carbon. There may be a debate about when, but anybody who knows anything about entropy will know that we're going to run out of that. What's your take on all of that? Because that's really what you talk about a lot of the time.
Thanks. Yeah, it's definitely becoming one of the defining issues of our generation. As I mentioned to you offline, this week marked the threshold of in terms of that atmospheric science, climate pollution, or measured in terms of parts per million of greenhouse gases, topping 400 ppm. And we already know from the climate science that once, that's already a level that's going to cause some serious changes and have a pretty high cost in terms of our ability to adapt to those changes. Once you start reaching 450, 550, where the trend line is going, then that's when you start getting into a point of
a tipping point.
A tipping point, exactly, where you're talking about very, very costly, irrevocable, changes that could lead to some really catastrophic damage. So now, the energy challenge is taking into account that we're running out of time to affect a major technological shift there. At the same time, we have this huge energy access challenge. And what I was talking about here, the UN International Sustainable Energy for All initiative, is really a global commitment that's now being put in place to address that energy poverty issue. Whereas, for example, in Africa, only 25% of the population has access to modern electricity. 3 out of 4 people at least are still using traditional biomass energy for cooking. So how are you going to meet those needs in a way that also doesn't jeopardize the climate by putting in more CO2 and other greenhouse gases into the atmosphere?
Because therein lies the rub, doesn't it? Because you've got this agenda that people are putting out and say, oh, we in Africa we only use 4% of the world's energy, and we want to increase that because that shows that we are progressing. Yeah. Fine, okay, but how that energy is generated is key, because still up until now the most efficient way of generating that energy is in fossil fuels.
Well, yes and no.
In terms of responsiveness.
Yes and no, because actually, large-scale hydropower is cheaper per kilowatt hour in Africa, and geothermal as well. So there are renewable energy alternatives that, without any kind of support, subsidies, are on parity. Even in South Africa, as the government continues to endorse, this renewable energy IPP program, we're seeing dramatic cost reductions, such that we are seeing within a 4 to 5 year time frame, very short time frame, price parity between what what Eskom will charge for its tariff, which is predominantly coal-based, and what can be met by large-scale solar PV. So the gap is closing, but the externality, that carbon externality, isn't really being fully priced in right now. We've seen, this is a big issue that we've been working on, is how to make those carbon markets work more effective, how to price that externality in.
Does the answer lie in carbon markets, do you think?
I don't think the entire answer, but it's definitely a piece of the puzzle. I think it's, from what we've seen, the markets can play a role in leveling the playing field. They can play a role in making certain types of projects more attractive that wouldn't otherwise. Particularly, what we've been talking about here is the smaller scale projects, which are really desperately needed in Africa because it's such a big land area and you've got a lot of dispersed rural populations. How do you make small and medium-sized renewable energy projects, your small-scale hydro projects, your wind projects that are not, 50 megawatts and above, that are easy to get financed? How do you make those kinds of things happen? Well, if you are getting a benefit of being able to either sell the carbon credits or get some sort of tax reduction or rebate because of the carbon reduction element, they can actually provide a boost to those projects that, wouldn't be the first place that investors and banks would start looking at, but they actually address that poverty issue in a more effective way because they're closer to where the demand is,
Yeah, no, I mean, I get that. If you've got a way, and in fact, we had people talking about that from Bentley earlier on in an interview where they're talking about very small hydro projects that just service that community, like a microgrid, and I understand that. I still kind of take issue with this concept of carbon trading as some way of fostering anything, because I've seen isolation, it being done in isolation, but it hasn't really galvanized a big drive, has it? I mean, we surely there must be some other thing in there, or do you think the whole thing's just so complex? And my question comes from the point you made about us going over the 400 part per million threshold.
Yeah.
We got there reasonably quickly. The 450 is not that far away. Surely we're running out of time to get on with it.
Sure, and I think there has been an important and healthy debate on whether carbon trading per se has done anything to foster that kind of technological innovation, and I think it's debatable. But in the short term, I think the private sector definitely responds to incentives, and so carbon trading is important. If there's a price on carbon, whether through a tax or through a trading regime, and that externality has to be accounted for, it's going to create an incentive. It's going to create an incentive in the short term to look at cleaner technologies and other sources of renewable energy that can achieve the same goal. I think the problem that has happened with the carbon trading markets is that there's been very poor kind of coordination. We're trying to set up a kind of a global scheme. Climate change is a global issue. You've got a lot of different issues in terms of kind of game playing and kind of race to the bottom sort of thing going on in that. So I think it's a regulatory challenge. It's a policy challenge. But from the private sector's point of view, I don't think they're against it. I think they're actually for it because it sets greater certainty. You've got a clear market signal and a clear price you've got to respond to. Whether it's a tax or a trading system, I think that's, to some degree.
So the issue mainly lies in the implementation of it and making those global connections to actually get it to work.
Yeah.
Rather than the idea itself.
Yeah, I think that, in the grand scheme of things, from a policy perspective, you could argue that it might be more effective to just put more funding into R&D and technology innovation. And I don't think it's an either or proposition. I think ideally they should be working hand in hand. One of the things I mentioned in my talk this morning was Africa needs to kind of get in the game on the innovation side as well, because I think there's a misperception, that, Africa is so underdeveloped and, we're in South Africa. South Africa was the first place there was a open heart transplant. And, and I think, we've seen with mobile technology and various other things that, given the right incentives and given in the right context, Africa does have the potential to innovate and create technologies that are really appropriate to what the needs are. And so I think from a climate change point of view, there's a big opportunity for governments and the private sector and academia to work together on low carbon technology that's appropriate for Africa, that's going to address some of these energy poverty needs. Certainly there's a high degree of willingness, I think, in the international community to fund interesting, partnerships that work on the ground that are commercializable. I think also in the mindset of, I'm obviously working in the international sector, and I think there's a lot more openness than there has ever been, to have commercially driven, sustainable solutions for these public, challenges and development challenges.
Well, that came through a bit in a few of the interviews we had, where people were, I think it's very complex and it's a big subject. So there was a inability to, well, not an inability, but to articulate it in a compartmentalized way is hard. But there was a definite resonance in this idea that there is a potential here to sort of leapfrog the way energy is delivered and the mix and everything, much like has maybe happened in the telecoms infrastructure. They haven't put in masses of fixed line, it's all gone over mobile, because that allows that sort of thing to happen, and you jump something.
Sure. Yeah, but like, for example, I studied this, in graduate school. I went to Brazil, and we looked at that issue. In hydropower, essentially, that was Brazil's contribution, to energy leapfrogging, was hydropower, big hydropower dams. They invented it, and they mastered it. And now you've got Brazilian companies here selling that to Africa, right? So, I think Africa needs to say, what is its comparative advantage?
Where do you think that is? Solar, wind?
If I had to say, I would say I think the best potential could probably be in bioenergy for Africa. Just my own feeling is, most economies in Africa are still agrarian. I mean, they're very much dependent on agriculture, the exporting agriculture. There's so much resource waste, in the sector that's not being exploited energetically. And as Brazil, they've been a pioneer in biofuels, and they've actually been able to kind of downscale the technology. And
genetics comes into it as well, microbiology.
Absolutely.
Because it's also not sustainable to just look at corn as, corn equals ethanol. You're like, hang on a minute, you got to use that to feed people as well, and it's so complex, isn't it?
Right. I mean, there's been a lot of advances in biosciences, so those things become a lot. Of course, with UNEP, we've done a lot of work on sustainability criteria in that area, and it is a real concern for sure. But with that new technology, there's also, I think, a much greater ability to produce bioenergy and biofuels in a way that does not compromise food security, and that can, kind of deliver what I think is sort of a golden sort of triangle of issues, something that's climate friendly, something that's promoting jobs and rural development, and that's really a hard thing in Africa, is really keeping people employed in rural areas, and also dealing with this energy issue, like providing new sources of energy for transport, for local industry, and I think we've also seen with some of the interesting bioenergy, it used to sort of only be the mindset that was only for fuel, for transportation. And now I think we're starting to see liquid biofuels and biogas being used more extensively in industry, more extensively, even for power generation. That shift is starting to happen more and more. And so, I think this is an opportunity maybe in Africa to and I've seen some interesting things here or there, but I don't know. It's like, what is going to be the sort of defining technology, right? That.
Well, what would you, if I gave you $1 million to bet on one, could you, or are we in a spread bet situation here?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think as a rational investor, you would spread your money on different things. Because I think, you know, we still are at an early stage in the game. But I think the point I was making is that from a technology point of view, I think it's important that governments and academia and industry in Africa start doing a little bit more serious, you know, coordination on developing technology roadmaps in the sector and actually figuring out what might be the institutional and human capacity bottlenecks that might prevent them from getting to that point, because otherwise Africa will continue to largely be dependent on importing technologies that, you know, may work great in Europe or in China.
Fit for purpose here.
Exactly.
Yeah. Because it's interesting you say that we're very early in that technology. So it's kind of frightening to hear those words where you go, well, we're very early in this technology, which is the alternative generation thing, yet we're at 400 parts per million on the other scale. So what do we need to accelerate and go from early to, you know, we can see something in 4 years, 5 years down the road? Because let's face it, that's probably the length of time we're looking at in terms of maturity on some of these solutions, aren't we?
Well, I think it comes with the territory with this, that there's always going to be an element that you sort of know and an element that you don't know. Some technological innovation comes inherently comes sort of by accident, you know. But
like energy storage and things like that, because I think that to me is the key. If we could figure out a way of storing, bottling all this stuff, then you know the wind turbine spinning at night is actually doing something useful.
Well, and also what I had mentioned in my talk is the issue of water efficiency and sustainability criteria. So not just assuming that all renewable energy technologies are sustainable. I mean, actually really looking at the water consumption. I mean, some kind of solar facilities in desert areas do require quite a lot of water consumption. You know, I mean, just to take a balanced view and say we need to get a better handle on that as well. And so some of the research and development could be also in terms of reducing the materials and water input into the production per unit of, you know,
because
PV.
That's a whole other side of things. When you look at actually, you know, how much carbon is burnt bolting this thing together, you know, and where we're going. Unfortunately, Glenn, for this interview, we've come to the end of it. I've got to ask you, because you obviously gave a presentation today, you had a bit of time to look around the show. Are there any sort of takeaways that sort of make you go, we're on the right direction here because this is what I've seen? Or
the takeaway message for me is that I've never seen as much clear private sector interest in investing in this sector in Africa, and I think that's tremendously good news. So I think there's exciting times ahead for the energy space in Africa, and I think it's incumbent now on you know, policymakers to work together with entities like UNEP to make sure that the regulatory environment is good, that there are sustainability guidelines in place to promote the right kinds of energy technologies and the right kind of energy mix, so that we're not locking in a kind of carbon-intensive future to meet, you know, this very thirsty continent. Yeah, to meet this very energy-thirsty continent, which, you know, and it's only fair that more energy, that there be a massive scale-up in energy supply. Africa needs it, but
it's the kind of energy that's going to be key.
And Africa's fortunate in that it is quite abundantly endowed with natural resources, with lots of sun and fairly good, you know, conditions for all of the renewable energy resources. So it's the technology at some level isn't as much the problem. It's you know, the financial structuring of projects, the ability to create the right framework in place to have a level playing field for renewable energy versus non-renewable fossil-based power projects. So I think those are the key challenges.
Well, it's great to have had you in here, and thank you for taking the time, and thank you for watching. I feel that we could have probably gone on for another 10 minutes, but we'll spare you that for this interview, and hopefully we'll have Glenn again in the studio and talk about some of the other issues that were raised. Thank you for watching.